Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Before we begin, take a deep breath. This story does not rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found, without ever being spoken aloud. If you are someone who believes that some stories are meant to be felt far more than they are told, then you are in the right place. Choices vanish quickly when you are poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. Arthur Sterling was not a wicked man, but he was a desperate one. My father was an idealistic dreamer whose failed business ventures did not end in grand, cinematic explosions. They ended in quiet, terrifying letters from aggressive banks. They ended in the slow disappearance of our modest furniture, the forced sale of the art supplies belonging to my mother, Sarah, and a creeping, suffocating weight that settled permanently over my shoulders the moment he fell into a critical, unresponsive state, leaving me entirely alone to hold up the collapsing sky, clutching a legacy of ruin that I had never asked to inherit. The man who eventually bought that crushing debt did not do it with a sinister smile. Julian Vance did not summon me to a dark boardroom to gloat over my misfortune. We sat across from each other in a sterile, brilliantly lit attorney's office in the city that smelled faintly of polished leather and bitter espresso. He slid a thick, heavy folder across the mahogany table toward me. It was a marriage of convenience. It was a cold, calculated settlement of ledgers designed to save me from total financial destruction. I signed my name on the dotted line, trading my fragile autonomy for my survival. The ink bled slightly into the thick paper, cementing my fate with dark permanence. There was no sweeping music playing in the background. There were no romantic vows exchanged, just heavy silence and the sharp, scratching sound of my fountain pen against the parchment. I expected a life of calculated endurance. I expected to become a ghost, quietly haunting the edges of my own life. The drive to Blackwood Crest took 4 long, agonizing hours. The Pacific Northwest winter was entirely unforgiving outside the tinted car windows. Heavy gray clouds hung low over the jagged, rocky coastline, pressing down violently on the dark, churning water of the freezing ocean. The rhythmic, hypnotic sound of the windshield wipers scraping against the glass was the only noise that dared to exist in the enclosed space. Inside the luxury vehicle, the silence between us was absolute and unyielding. The man sitting beside me did not try to fill the heavy space with empty, polite reassurance. He did not ask how I was feeling or pretend that this transaction was a traditional honeymoon. He simply kept his dark eyes fixed firmly on the winding, rain-slicked road ahead. His sharp profile resembled winter stone, immovable, heavily guarded, and entirely unreadable to me. When we finally arrived at the estate, I quickly realized Blackwood Crest was not a home. It was a fortress. The sprawling stone mansion sat perched ominously on a high wind-battered cliff, surrounded by giant, ancient pines that seemed to stand as silent sentinels against the approaching storm. When I stepped out of the warm car, the freezing salt-laced air bit fiercely through my thin wool coat. Julian did not offer me his tailored jacket. He did not touch the small of my back to guide me up the massive stone steps. Instead, he quietly unlocked the heavy front doors and stepped aside, keeping a vast, respectful distance as he allowed me to enter the grand foyer first. It was a silent act of yielding space, a clear physical boundary he immediately established between us. He walked me methodically through the sprawling estate. The rooms were vast, immaculate, and largely empty of any personal warmth. The walls were painted in stark, unforgiving shades of white and slate, absorbing whatever meager light managed to filter through the heavy rain clouds. There were no framed photographs resting on the massive stone mantels. There were no stray, half-read books left behind on the worn leather reading chairs. There were no scuff marks on the baseboards. No discarded coats draped casually over a wooden banister. The air inside the house smelled faintly of rich cedar wood and sharp lemon wax, carrying a clinical perfection that made my chest feel uncomfortably tight. It felt less like a living sanctuary and more like a carefully maintained museum, dedicated to someone who had long since stopped breathing. I followed the steady, rhythmic sound of his footsteps on the dark hardwood floors, my own breath feeling far too loud and intrusive in the cavernous, echoing halls. We eventually climbed the grand staircase and reached the third floor. He led me toward the eastern wing. The hallway here was noticeably narrower, the gray afternoon light filtering through the high crescent windows to cast long, distorted shadows against the polished floorboards. At the very end of the silent corridor stood a single, heavy cherrywood door. It was the only door in the entire mansion that looked distinctly out of place. It was older, its wood richer and darker against the pale, sterile walls of the corridor, radiating a strange sense of gravity. Set into the thick wood was a heavy locked brass handle. The metal was worn smooth, slightly tarnished at the curved edges, as if someone stood before it in the dark and touched it countless times over the lonely years without ever turning it. Julian stopped abruptly in front of it. The subtle, almost imperceptible relaxation in his broad shoulders, a slight loosening of his posture I had not even consciously registered, vanished instantly. He reached out his arms slowly and rested his bare fingertips against the cold metal of the locked brass handle. I stood a few feet away, watching his hand closely. Within seconds, his knuckles were turning stark, bone white. The physical pressure he applied to the unyielding metal was immense, betraying a sudden, violent spike of internal tension that he was desperately trying to hide from my view. "This entire wing is yours," he said. His voice was entirely casual, soft and terrifyingly at odds with the severe physical strain clearly visible in his trembling hand. He did not look back at me. His dark gaze remained rigidly fixed on the deep grain of the cherry wood. "You have the lower library, the bright studio, downstairs, the southern stone terrace. You may change them. You may tear down the walls if you wish, Clara." He paused for a fraction of a second, his thumb brushing the tarnished edge of the metal. "But this door remains locked. You must never ask me to open it, and you must never try to open it yourself." He did not wait for my verbal agreement. He did not issue a dark, theatrical threat, nor did he raise his deep voice to assert his dominance over me. He simply let his hand fall away from the handle. The blood rushed rapidly back into his pale knuckles, and he turned smoothly to walk back down the dim corridor, his posture rigid and unapproachable once more. I stood there alone for a long, heavy moment, listening to his firm footsteps fade into the cavernous depths of the massive house. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. I looked back at the heavy locked brass handle. Strangely, I did not feel the cold prickle of fear. I felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of heavy sorrow wash over me. He was not guarding a monster in that forbidden room. He was guarding a wound. 2 agonizingly slow hours passed. The coastal winter storms rolled in, one after another, relentlessly battering the thick stone walls of Blackwood Crest, with freezing rain and howling wind. The sheer silence of the massive house became a physical entity I had to actively navigate around. It did not have sharp teeth. It did not bite or tear at my fragile composure. It was simply heavy, pressing down on my chest from the moment I woke up in my massive, empty bedroom until the moment I closed my eyes at night. I spent my long, solitary days wandering the lower grounds of the estate. The mansion was vast, a labyrinth of high ceilings and cold marble that seemed to swallow sound entirely. I would stand by the tall, arching windows of the conservatory for hours, watching the violent gray waves crash against the jagged rocks far below. The sea was wild and untamed, a sharp contrast to the suffocating stillness inside. I memorized the intricate, fading patterns of the woven Persian rugs in the drawing rooms. I ran my fingertips over the cracked spines of thousands of unread books in the towering library, inhaling the comforting scent of old paper and dust. I even ventured into the bright studio downstairs, tracing the edge of the empty easel he had provided, though I could not yet bring myself to hold a piece of charcoal. My father's debt still felt too heavy in my hands. My husband was almost always gone before I woke, leaving for the city before the sun broke the gray horizon, and returning long after the sun's hide turned to pitch black. We lived entirely separate lives under the same massive, echoing roof. I was a ghost in his house, and he was a shadow in mine. And yet there were undeniable signs of his silent presence. Every single afternoon, without fail, I would find the steam-examining Jasmine's tea resting patiently on the small wooden table outside whichever room I had chosen to occupy for the day. There was never a handwritten note attached. There was never a spoken explanation offering comfort. There was just the delicate, white porcelain cup, the pale yellow liquid radiating a gentle, comforting heat into the frigid air. The soft, floral scent cut sharply through the sterile cedarwood atmosphere of the lonely mansion, a quiet daily proof that I was being watched over, rather than simply confined. On the 14th day of our cold arrangement, the power flickered and died completely for several hours. The storm outside was particularly violent that afternoon, the freezing rain lashing fiercely against the tall glass windows, with a furious, chaotic rhythm. Seeking any source of warmth, I made my way blindly through the dark corridors to the lower library, wrapping my thick wool cardigan tightly around my shivering shoulders. The massive stone hearth in the center of the room had burned low, leaving behind a wide bed of glowing, angry orange embers that casts a weak, shifting light across the floor. I knelt carefully on the woven rug, extending my trembling, cold hands toward the fading heat of the fire. That was when I saw it. Tucked just off to the far side of the stone grate, half hidden beneath a heavy wrought iron poker, was a singed piece of paper. It was thick, textured parchment, its edges violently curled and blackened by the fire. Someone had clearly tried to burn it entirely, but the sudden draft from the wide chimney had blown it clear of the direct flames before it could be fully consumed by the heat. Curiosity overriding my usual caution, I reached out. My fingers brushed the cold, soot-stained surface of the scrap. The dark handwriting hastily scribbled across the center was sharp, hurried, and deeply familiar to my eyes. It looked exactly like a torn fragment of an old financial ledger, the precise kind Arthur Sterling used to obsessively keep before the terrible ruin finally swallowed our family whole. I wouldn't touch that, Mrs. Vance. I startled violently, my pulse jumping rapidly in my throat as I instinctively pulled my hand back from the hearth. Beatrice Thorne stood silently in the dark archway of the library. The older housekeeper was a woman of absolute, terrifying stillness. She moved through the vast halls of Blackwood Crest like a phantom, her plain gray dresses blending seamlessly into the deep shadows of the long corridors. She stood there now, balancing a heavy silver tea tray flawlessly in her weathered hands. Resting perfectly in the center of the polished metal was the steaming jasmine tea. I swallowed the sudden thick lump in my throat, my pride instinctively hardening into a familiar defensive shield against the intrusion. "I was only looking," I said, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. It caught the draft from the chimney. I thought it might be a fire hazard. Mrs. Thorne did not scold me for snooping. She did not raise her voice to reprimand me, nor did she rush forward to snatch the burned paper scrap away with dramatic, secretive urgency. She simply walked forward into the dim light and set the silver tea tray down on a nearby mahogany side table, with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Then, she walked over to the stone hearth. She knelt carefully beside me on the rug, her old, arthritic joints popping softly in the quiet, fire-lit room. She reached out and gently took the burned paper scrap from my hesitating fingers. She looked down at the blackened, crumbling edges, her normally stern expression softening into something that looked dangerously like pity. It was not malice. It was a gentle, deeply protective sorrow that seemed to age her features by another 10 years in the flickering light. "Some places in this massive house are very cold, Clara," she murmured quietly, using my given name for the very first time, since Oide has arrived with my luggage, and some memories are far too fragile to be touched by the cold air. They turn to ash before you can ever make sense of them. She did not throw the fragment back into the glowing embers to finish the job. Instead, she carefully folded the ruined scrap, hiding the sharp, familiar handwriting, safely within the blackened creases, and slipped it deep into the large pocket of her thick apron. She stood back up, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her gray skirt with a practiced motion. "Drink your tea before it cools," she instructed softly, gesturing respectfully toward the silver tray resting in the shadows. "Mr. Vance blended the jasmine leaves himself this morning before he left for the city. He prefers it when you are kept warm." She turned gracefully and melted back into the dark shadows of the long hallway without another word, leaving me entirely alone with the glowing red embers and the soothing, floral scent of the tea filling the air. I sat on the floor in the silence for a very long time. I looked at the delicate porcelain cup waiting patiently for me, I thought of the heavy locked brass handle on the third floor. I thought of Julian's bloodless, white knuckles, straining against the metal, and the ruined ledger piece, now hidden safely, in a quiet housekeeper's pocket. I reached out and wrapped my cold hands firmly around the warm teacup, letting the deep, radiating heat seep slowly into my freezing palms. I closed my eyes as the violent storm raged against the glass outside. The floral scent of the tea was a grounding force in the darkness, a quiet, undeniable tether to a man who refused to speak, but also refused to let me freeze. This grand, silent house was not a cold prison built to hold me as collateral for my father's failures. It was a massive stone vault, built, specifically, to bury something deeply painful, and I was standing right in the very center of it, waiting for the ice to finally crack. The dining table was an expansive slab of dark mahogany, vast enough to seat 20, yet only 3 places were set at the far end. Mrs. Thorne had arranged the heavy crystal dinnerware with a terrifying, geometric precision. The cut glass caught the sharp, fractured light of the chandelier overhead, casting distorted prisms across the pristine white linen tablecloth. Every time one of us lifted a heavy silver fork, the tiny clinking sound echoed against the high, vaulted ceiling, like a judge's gavel demanding order in an empty courtroom. We were a family resurrected from the ashes of absolute ruin, sitting in a billionaire's fortress, pretending that the roasted root vegetables and sharp burgundy wine were simply a normal Sunday dinner. The world believed Arthur Sterling had passed away on a cold Tuesday months ago, the massive heart attack that stopped his pulse for 3 agonizing minutes. In a sterile emergency room, was recorded by the public as the tragic end of a failed visionary. But Julian Vance's immense wealth did not just buy my compliance. It bought quiet miracles hidden behind closed doors. It funded the experimental, life-saving treatments that pulled my mother, Sarah, back from the very edge of her terminal illness. It paid for the elite, secluded convalescence that slowly brought my father back to the land of the living, safely away from the aggressive creditors who wanted to see him permanently buried. They were both breathing, their crushing debts erased with a single stroke of my fountain pen, but the sheer cost of their survival hung heavy in the frigid air between us. We were all physically alive, yet we felt like distant strangers, haunting the edges of a life we did not truly own. My mother looked incredibly fragile in the high-backed velvet chair. Her artistic hands, which used to smell of turpentine and fresh clay in our old coastal cabin, were now pale and trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. Beside her, the man who had once filled every room with his booming, idealistic dreams sat entirely diminished. Arthur kept his hollowed eyes firmly fixed on his porcelain plate. He refused to look up at the towering stone walls of Blackwood Crest, acting as if the very architecture of the isolated estate was quietly accusing him of his past sins. I watched him push a piece of roasted meat around with his fork, desperately wishing I could bridge the vast, suffocating gap that had opened between us since I signed the marriage contract. The estate is very grand, Clara, my mother murmured softly, her voice barely cutting through the oppressive silence of the dining room. She offered me a tentative, gentle smile that did not quite reach her tired eyes. Do you spend much time exploring the grounds? I walk the southern terrace mostly, I replied, keeping my tone intentionally light, wanting to project an illusion of comfort I did not actually possess. The lower library is quite warm. There are thousands of books. It is very quiet here, but it is not entirely unpleasant. I took a slow sip of the dark wine, letting the sharp bitter taste ground me before I continued. Julian leaves me to my own devices. He gave me free rein of the entire house. Well, almost the entire house. My father finally stopped pushing his food. His fork rested against the edge of the plate with a dull, heavy clink. He did not look up, but the sudden, rigid stiffness in his narrow shoulders was immediately palpable across the table. The third floor is mostly empty, I continued, unaware of the rapid shift in the atmospheric pressure. He offered me the bright studio downstairs, but he was very specific about the eastern wing. There is a single cherry wood door at the end of the long corridor. It has a heavy brass handle. He told me it must remain permanently locked. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely violent. The older man's hand, which had been resting near his heavy water goblet, seized with a sudden, uncontrollable spasm. His pale fingers knocked sharply against the thick glass. The crystal dinnerware tipped over the edge of the mahogany table, hitting the polished hardwood floor with a deafening, explosive shatter. The sound tore through the quiet dining room like a gunshot. Shards of thick, glittering glass exploded outward, scattering across the dark wood like broken ice. I jumped slightly in my chair, my heart leaping into my throat. "Father?" I asked, my voice laced with sudden alarm. I looked at his face. All the remaining color had completely drained from his weathered cheeks. His eyes were blown wide, fixed blindly on the empty space where the glass had been, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He was not just startled by his own clumsiness. He was in the grip of a sheer paralyzing terror. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to grip the edge of the heavy table just to keep himself upright. Before I could stand up to reach him, Sarah moved. She pushed her chair back with a sharp scrape that intentionally drowned out the sound of his ragged breathing. Without a single moment of hesitation, my mother stepped directly forward into the mess. She was wearing thin, soft-soled slippers, and she deliberately brought her heel down hard onto the largest, sharpest piece of the broken crystal dinnerware. The sickening crunch of the glass, shattering further beneath her weight, was immediately followed by her sharp, audible gasp of pain. "Oh, clumsy of me," she breathed out quickly, her sides tightening as she leaned heavily against the edge of the table for support. "Clara, I am so sorry." I stepped right into it. The distraction was flawlessly executed and fiercely protective. My entire focus snapped violently away from the older man's panic and zeroed in on her immediate physical pain. I rushed around the large table, dropping to my knees on the dark hardwood to check her foot, my hands hovering anxiously over the glittering shards. Above me, I could hear Arthur slowly forcing air into his lungs, using the agonizing diversion my mother had just created to frantically rebuild his shattered composure. "Do not move," I whispered firmly, carefully sweeping the dangerous pieces away from her slipper. "Mrs. Thorne." The quiet housekeeper materialized from the dark hallway almost instantly, bearing a thick towel and a small brass dustpan. She did not ask questions. She merely knelt beside me in absolute silence, expertly manning the cleanup up while I guided my limping mother back to her chair. Through it all, the older man remained completely mute, his shaking hands hidden safely beneath the white linen tablecloth. He did not look at me for the rest of the evening. He did not look toward the grand staircase leading up to the third floor. Whatever deep, buried nightmare the mention of that locked wing had just violently awakened in him. It was a terror he was absolutely forbidden to speak aloud. When Julian finally returned from the city an hour later, the heavy thud of the front doors echoed up into the vaulted ceilings. I was waiting for him in the dim, shifting light of the grand foyer. His dark wool overcoat was damp with the freezing coastal rain, his face tight with the exhaustion of a long, ruthless day of corporate warfare. I did not offer a polite greeting. "My parents were here for dinner," I said quietly, stepping deliberately into his path before he could retreat toward his study. He paused, his large hand resting lightly on the carved wooden banister. He did not look surprised by their visit. I hope Mrs. Thorne accommodated them well. Arthur dropped his glass when I mentioned the eastern wing. I pushed, taking a step closer. The cold air radiating from his damp coat washed over my skin. When I mentioned the locked door, he looked as though he had seen a ghost. "Julian, what is he afraid of?" The faint, polite mask of civility vanished completely from my husband's sharp features. His dark eyes hardened into impenetrable winter stone, closing off whatever small fraction of vulnerability he had carried through the front door. "Your father is an old man recovering from a severe medical trauma, Clara," he replied, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "His nerves are fragile. Do not press him on matters that do not concern you." "It concerns me if it terrifies him," I countered, refusing to back down, my chin lifting defensively against his commanding presence. "Leave the past where it belongs," he instructed softly, the absolute finality in his tone leaving no room for negotiation. He turned his broad back to me and walked into the deep shadows of the hallway, effectively shutting the heavy door on the conversation. Hours later, long after my parents had retreated to the safety of their guest quarters in the western wing. The suffocating silence of Blackwood Crest returned to claim the empty spaces. The violent storm outside had softened into a steady, freezing drizzle that tapped gently against the tall glass panes. I could not sleep. The image of Arthur's bloodless, terrified face played over and over in my tired mind, a dark, unsolvable puzzle that made the air in my massive bedroom feel impossibly thin. The image of my mother intentionally driving a shard of broken glass into her own foot to protect him from my innocent questions was a horrifying revelation. It proved they were bound by a shared, unspoken guilt that went far deeper than simple financial debt. I slipped out of my cold bed and pulled a long, heavy silk robe over my thin nightgown, tying the sash tightly around my waist to ward off the biting draft. The smooth, cool fabric offered little comfort against the deep internal chill radiating from my chest. I needed to understand what had just happened. I walked quietly through the dim corridors, the soft padding of my bare feet absorbed entirely by the thick Persian rugs. I moved back toward his private study on the ground floor, determined to demand a real answer, regardless of his earlier warning. The heavy oak door was left slightly ajar, a single sliver of warm, amber light spilling out across the dark stone hallway. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find him sitting behind the massive desk. But the room was completely empty. The air inside smelled deeply of rich cedarwood and the faint, metallic scent of cold rain. Resting near the edge of the leather-bound blotter was his gold pocket watch. The heavy chain was pulled carelessly onto the polished wood, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the internal gears, echoing softly in the vacant room. Beside the watch lay an old family photograph. I moved closer, my breath catching painfully in my throat as I looked down at the faded image. It was a picture of Sarah Arthur and a much younger me. Standing happily in front of our small coastal cabin, my mother must have quietly left it there on the desk earlier in the evening, perhaps as a silent, desperate plea for mercy. Or perhaps it was a physical reminder of a past I did not yet fully understand. He was not in his study. He was not in the lower library. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I turned away from the ticking pocket watch and walked slowly toward the grand staircase. The cold marble steps bit sharply into the soles of my bare feet, but I did not stop. I climbed past the second floor, the shadows growing longer and deeper as I approached the narrower, crescent-windowed hallway of the third floor. The pale moonlight filtered through the glass, casting long, silver bars across the dark wooden floorboards. As I rounded the final corner leading into the eastern wing, I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart slamming violently against my ribs. At the very end of the long corridor, sitting on the cold hardwood floor, directly in front of the locked cherrywood door, was Julian. He was completely stripped of the immaculate, terrifying armor he wore during the day. His tailored suit jacket was gone, his dark vest discarded somewhere in the shadows. He wore only a crisp, white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his forearms, the collar unbuttoned to reveal the exhausted tension in his thick neck. The sheer physical size of the man was immense, yet in the pale moonlight, his posture was shockingly, painfully small. He was sitting with his long legs pulled tightly inward, his knees resting firmly against his chest in a deeply vulnerable, almost childlike stance that felt entirely alien to the ruthless tycoon who had purchased my family's debts. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold plaster wall to keep myself completely hidden in the shadows. Julian did not look at the heavy brass handle. Instead, he reached out his hand and gently rested his bare fingertips against the dark grain of the wood. With agonizing slowness, he began to trace the outline of the heavy door frame with a single finger. It was not a gesture of guarding a cold prison. It was a gesture of profound, devastating reverence. It was the exact way a grieving man touches a weathered headstone in the dead of winter. The absolute silence of the hallway was broken, only by the sound of the freezing rain outside, until he finally spoke. His voice was so quiet, so remarkably fragile, that I almost convinced myself the wind had made the sound. But in the still, heavy air of the corridor, the words were undeniable. "I am so sorry," he whispered softly to the locked wood. He did not move to open it. He did not attempt to unlock the secrets hidden on the other side. He merely rested his forehead against the cold surface of the cherrywood, closing his eyes as his broad shoulders trembled with a heavy, silent weight that no amount of money could ever lift. I stood frozen in the dark, my hands gripping the edges of my silk robe so tightly that my knuckles ached. The narrative I had built in my head, the story of a calculating jailer who bought my life to punish my father's failures, shattered instantly, falling away like the broken pieces of the crystal dinnerware. He was not holding me captive in this grand mansion. He was holding himself captive, and whatever was waiting patiently behind that locked door was the key to a shared ruin that had bound our lives together. Long before I ever signed my name on his dotted line, I did not step forward to comfort him. I did not demand the truth. Not because I was afraid of his anger, but because I knew that stepping into the light right now would force him to raise his impenetrable armor once more. Instead, I took a slow, silent step backward, fading quietly into the deep shadows of the long hallway, leaving the broken giant to his solitary grief. 3 days after the shattered crystal on the dining room floor, and the sight of a broken giant weeping in the dark corridor, the suffocating atmosphere of Blackwood Crest shifted. Julian left before dawn on a Thursday for a corporate merger in the city. His departure did not involve a formal goodbye. There was no polite knock on my bedroom door, no lingering hesitation in the grand foyer. He simply vanished into the freezing coastal rain, taking the overwhelming, immovable weight of his presence with him. For the first time since I had signed my name on that cold financial contract, I was entirely alone in the sprawling stone fortress. The absence of the man who had bought my father's debts should have felt like a profound relief. Instead, the massive house felt strangely unmoored without him. The echoing silence of the long hallways no longer felt like a heavy shield meant to keep me at a distance. It felt entirely hollow, like an exhaled breath waiting desperately to be drawn back into the lungs. My quiet domestic routine continued without interruption. The brutal Pacific Northwest winter raged relentlessly outside the tall arching windows, hurling sheets of gray, freezing rain against the thick glass panes. Yet, exactly at noon, I found the steaming jasmine tea waiting patiently on the small mahogany side table near the conservatory doors. Mrs. Thorne had left it there in absolute silence, a ghost moving through the cavernous estate to ensure I was anchored by warmth. I wrapped my cold fingers around the delicate porcelain cup, letting the familiar floral scent cut through the sterile lemon wax and sharp cedarwood that defined the mansion. He was miles away, but his silent language of care remained perfectly intact. I took a slow, grounding sip of the hot liquid, the warmth blooming steadily in my chest. But the comfort was abruptly shattered. Later that afternoon, the coastal storm escalated from a violent, relentless downpour into a deafening roar. A massive gust of wind battered the jagged cliffside, rattling the heavy glass of the conservatory. Then, with a sudden, hollow metallic groan that vibrated deep through the ancient stone floors, the estate's electrical grid failed. The entire mansion was instantly plunged into absolute darkness. The sudden absence of the low electrical hum made the sprawling house feel even more isolated. I set my empty porcelain teacup down onto its silver saucer, the clink sharp in the suffocating gloom. I needed light. Navigating the pitch-black corridors strictly by memory and the faint, diffuse gray illumination filtering through the storm-lashed windows, I made my way toward the ground floor study. I was hoping Julian kept emergency wax candles, or a heavy flashlight stashed somewhere in his desk. The heavy oak door of the study was closed, but it was not locked. I pressed my palm flat against the cool wood and pushed it open, the heavy brass hinges groaning softly in the quiet air. The room was bathed in the pale, diffused silver light of the winter storm outside. It was a vast, imposing space, dominated by towering, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves built from dark, polished mahogany. The air inside was thick and deeply comforting, smelling intensely of old paper, binding glue, and the rich, masculine scent of cedarwood that always seemed to linger on his tailored coats. I stepped cautiously over the threshold, my soft-soled shoes making no sound against the thick Persian rug. His massive desk sat in the center of the room, impeccably organized. The faded family photograph was exactly where it had been, days ago, resting quietly near the edge of the leather-bound blotter. The image of Arthur, Sarah, and a much younger me, standing before our coastal cabin, was a painful, beautiful anchor in the middle of a billionaire's sterile empire. I brushed my fingertips lightly over the edge of the silver frame, a sudden wave of melancholic yearning washing over my skin, before I pulled open the top drawer of his desk to search for a light source. My hand brushed against a set of thick wax candles and a heavy silver lighter. I retrieved them and quickly sparked a flame. The warm, flickering amber light pushed back the suffocating shadows of the study, illuminating the dark wood of his workspace. It was then, as I set the lighter down, that my eyes fell upon an object resting near the far corner of the leather blotter, partially obscured by a neat stack of financial files. It was a small cedarwood box. It was unmarked, simple, and entirely unpolished, standing in stark contrast to the severe, expensive decor of the room. I reached out, my trembling fingers brushing the smooth grain of the wood, and carefully lifted the heavy lid. The interior of the small box was lined with a bed of dark, plush velvet. Resting silently in the center of that velvet depression was a key. I stared down at the object, the air in the quiet study suddenly feeling impossibly thin. It was a heavy, vintage piece of metal. The brass key featured an intricate, looping bow and a long, thick shaft that ended in complex hand-filed teeth. It was not a modern, electronic keycard used to secure a corporate vault. It was old, forged with a level of craftsmanship that belonged to a completely different century. I reached into the cedarwood box and picked it up. The cold metal immediately began to draw the heat from my trembling fingers. As I lifted it closer to my face to examine the intricate grooves, by the flickering candlelight, a very distinct, entirely unexpected scent drifted up from the brass. It was not the smell of lemon wax, nor was it the sterile metallic odor of a factory. It was the soft, soothing scent of pure lavender oil. My breath caught painfully in the back of my throat. I closed my eyes, entirely paralyzed by the sensory intrusion. When I was a little girl, terrified by the violent thunder that rattled the thin windows of our coastal cabin, Sarah would sit on the edge of my bed and rub a single drop of lavender oil onto my small wrists. She would tell me that the scent was a magic shield, a quiet barrier that no nightmare could ever cross. The man who had bought my life had not secured this key in a high-tech, impenetrable titanium safe. He had not buried it beneath complex alarm systems, or locked it behind a retinal scanner in his corporate office. He had placed it inside a small cedarwood box on his desk, and he had deliberately scented the cold metal with the exact fragrance my mother used to chase away my deepest fears. He had not hidden the key to keep me out permanently. He had left it in a place where I would inevitably find it in the dark, waiting patiently for the exact moment I felt brave enough to cross the boundary he had drawn. Sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits. I gently closed the cedarwood box, took the lit wax candle in my left hand, and walked out of the study. My right hand was curled tightly around the brass key, the sharp teeth pressing firmly into my palm, like a physical anchor keeping me tethered to the ground. I climbed the grand marble staircase, my soft-soled shoes completely silent against the cold stone. The shadows danced and flickered wildly along the walls as I ascended past the second floor, my pulse drumming a steady, deafening rhythm in my ears. I moved into the narrower, crescent-windowed corridor of the third floor. I walked down the length of the eastern wing, the silver rain beating fiercely against the glass panes until I reached the very end of the hall. I stopped in front of the heavy cherrywood door. The tarnished brass handle gleamed faintly in the low candlelight, a silent guardian protecting a truth that had terrified Arthur to the point of a physical collapse. I did not hesitate, not because I was fearless, but because the scent of lavender oil lingering on my skin told me that whatever was waiting on the other side of this wood was not a monster meant to devour me. I raised my hand, guided the thick shaft of the brass key into the dark keyhole, and turned my wrist. The internal mechanism did not grind or fight against the intrusion. The heavy tumblers clicked over smoothly, perfectly oiled and maintained, releasing the lock with a soft, deeply satisfying thud that echoed quietly in the empty corridor. I placed my hand over the cold brass handle, pressed downward, and pushed the heavy door open. I stepped slowly over the threshold, entirely prepared to face a dark, suffocating room filled with the dust of a forgotten tragedy. I expected a morbid shrine, a windowless cell, or a mountain of hidden ledgers detailing the exact mechanics of my family's ruin. Instead, I stepped directly into the sunlight of my own past. The air inside the room was incredibly warm, entirely devoid of the sharp, clinical chill that permeated the rest of the grand estate. The heavy scent of dried lavender and fresh pine washed over me instantly, wrapping around my trembling shoulders like a thick, familiar blanket. I stood frozen just inside the doorway, my eyes sweeping wildly across the space, unable to process the absolute impossibility of what I was looking at. The walls were not painted in the stark, unforgiving shades of slate and white that Julian favored. They were covered in a soft, pale yellow wallpaper, patterned with tiny, faded blue cornflowers. The floorboards were not polished, immaculate hardwood. They were wide, heavily distressed planks of reclaimed oak, intentionally scuffed and worn down to mimic the exact texture of a rustic cabin. Resting in the corner of the room was a small, hand-carved wooden bed frame. Draped carefully over the mattress was a thick, handmade patchwork quilt, sewn from mismatched squares of faded denim, soft pink cotton, and old flannel. Sitting near the large, arching window was a tiny, battered wooden desk covered in empty glass jars meant to hold sea glass, accompanied by a small wooden stool that looked like it had been built by an amateur carpenter, trying his best to create something sturdy. My chest heaved as I took a staggering, unstable step forward, my hand flying up to cover my mouth to stifle the sharp gasp tearing from my throat. It was my bedroom. It was an absolutely flawless, full-scale reconstruction of the childhood bedroom I had slept in before the debts arrived, before the banks took the coastal cabin, before my father's desperate failures systematically dismantled every piece of safety I had ever known. The billionaire who had purchased my life had not built a dungeon to punish me. He had spent an unimaginable fortune meticulously resurrecting the exact physical dimensions of my lost sanctuary, piece by stolen piece, hiding it away in the deepest corner of his sterile fortress. I walked blindly toward the center of the room, my legs feeling entirely numb, my mind violently rejecting the sheer scale of the devotion required to build this space. I stopped in the middle of the woven rug, my eyes drawn magnetically to the main wall above the small wooden desk. Hanging there, illuminated by the warm glow of my single candle, was a large frame made of dark, polished walnut. Behind the pristine, museum-quality glass was a single piece of thick, textured paper. The edges of the paper were frayed, slightly yellowed by the relentless passage of time, bearing the undeniable marks of a deeply loved, heavily handled object. I moved closer, the air catching painfully in my lungs. It was a drawing. It was a chaotic, brilliant mix of heavy charcoal smudges and vibrant, waxy pastel strokes. The image depicted a massive, towering stone house, perched on the very edge of a jagged, dark cliff. Surrounding the stone walls were giant, sweeping pine trees, their branches rendered in aggressive slashes of deep green crayon. A massive arching window dominated the front of the house, and inside that window, a warm, bright yellow light burned fiercely against a dark, stormy sky. It was the childhood drawing. I reached out, my trembling fingertips lightly tracing the cold surface of the protective glass. I knew every single erratic line of the sketch. I knew the exact way the black charcoal had smudged across the paper when my small hand dragged over it. I lowered my gaze to the bottom right corner of the frayed paper. Written there, in uneven, clumsy, heavily pressed red crayon, was a misspelled signature that I had etched into the fiber myself over a decade and a half ago. Clara, age 7. A hot, stinging tear spilled over my lower lash line, charting a slow burning path down my pale cheek. I turned my head slowly, looking away from the framed artwork and staring out the large window of the reconstructed bedroom. Outside the glass, the violent Pacific Northwest storm was thrashing against the very real, very massive stone walls of Blackwood Crest. The giant, ancient pines swayed furiously in the howling wind, standing as dark sentinels on the edge of the jagged cliff. The architecture, the placement of the windows, the very stone that made up the fortress I had been living in for the past months. It all mirrored the chaotic, imaginative strokes of a 7-year-old girl dreaming of a grand, untouchable castle. The narrative did not just shatter, it evaporated entirely into the warm, lavender-scented air. Julian Vance had not bought a random, isolated mansion in the Pacific Northwest to lock me away as his collateral. He had literally built the house I had drawn when I was a child. He had taken the fragile, crayon-smeared dream of a little girl who had lost everything, and he had poured millions of dollars into dragging that exact dream out of the paper and forging it into cold, undeniable stone. The sterile hallways, the heavy mahogany, the vast, echoing rooms. They were the outer shell, the impenetrable armor designed to protect this single, fragile, perfectly preserved heart beating silently on the third floor. He was not my jailer. He was the architect of my forgotten salvation. And as I stood alone in the quiet warmth of the room he had built just for me, surrounded by the physical evidence of a love so profound and silent that it defied logic, the deep, ancient ice that had encased my heart for years, finally, irreversibly cracked wide open. The heavy, rhythmic sound of the massive front doors, slamming shut, echoed violently through the cavernous, darkened halls of Blackwood Crest, cutting through the relentless howling of the coastal storm outside. I stood completely frozen in the center of the warm, lavender-scented bedroom, my trembling fingers still hovering inches away from the protective glass of the childhood drawing. The estate's electrical grid was still entirely dead. Whoever had just entered the pitch-black mansion had done so in a frantic, desperate rush, abandoning all the quiet, calculated composure that usually governed this sterile fortress. Heavy, uneven footsteps began to take the grand marble staircase two at a time. The sound was reckless, lacking the measured, terrifying precision I had come to associate with my husband. He had left for the city before dawn to oversee a ruthless corporate merger. He was supposed to be sitting in a brilliantly lit, mahogany-paneled boardroom, surrounded by executives and financial ledgers. Instead, the moment the power grid had failed in the severe winter weather, Julian Vance must have abandoned his empire entirely. He had driven blindly through the treacherous, freezing rain, risking the slick coastal roads, simply because he knew I was left alone in the dark. The rapid footsteps reached the third floor. They hurried down the narrow, crescent-windowed corridor of the eastern wing, the floorboards groaning under his weight. I did not move. I did not try to hide. The brass key still clutched tightly in my left hand. I simply turned slowly toward the open cherrywood doorway, waiting for the shadows to finally part. Julian appeared in the threshold, and the sheer sight of him caused the breath to catch painfully in my throat. The impenetrable, stoic armor of the untouchable billionaire was completely gone, washed away by the violent Pacific Northwest storm. His dark hair was plastered wildly to his forehead, dripping cold water onto the collar of his crisp white shirt. His heavy wool overcoat was completely saturated. It clung heavily to his broad shoulders, leaving a dark, pooling trail of freezing rain on the reclaimed oak floorboards. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths, his lungs struggling to pull oxygen from the quiet air. He stopped dead the moment he saw the door wide open. His dark, frantic eyes swept over the soft yellow wallpaper, the battered wooden desk, the handmade patchwork quilt, and finally landed on me, standing directly beneath the framed crayon sketch. He did not shout. He did not issue a cold, terrifying reprimand for violating his strict rules, nor did he march into the room to assert his absolute authority over the space. Instead, the massive, unyielding giant of a man simply crumbled. The profound, rigid tension that had held his spine perfectly straight for months evaporated in a single heartbeat. He leaned heavily against the dark cherrywood doorframe, closing his eyes as a ragged, devastating exhale shuddered through his large frame. I did not step backward. I did not raise my defensive shields. The deep, ancient ice that had encased my heart for years had already melted into the warm air of the reconstructed room. I watched the man who had bought my father's debts slowly lower his head, entirely humbled by the quiet truth we were finally sharing in the candlelight. "You were not supposed to be in the dark," Julian whispered, his deep voice cracking under the immense weight of the silence. He opened his eyes, refusing to look at the drawing on the wall, keeping his dark gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards between my bare feet. The storm knocked out the main grid in the city. I tried to call the estate. When the lines were dead, I drove back. I thought you would be frightened. "I found the key," I replied softly, my voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain lashing against the massive arching window. I held up my left hand, the heavy vintage metal gleaming faintly in the amber candlelight. You left it in a cedarwood box on your desk. You scented it with lavender oil, Julian. You knew I would find it. He finally lifted his head. The raw, unguarded vulnerability in his expression was completely paralyzing. He looked at me with a desperate, unspoken pleading, terrified that the revelation of this room would cause me to run back out into the freezing rain. He took a single, hesitant step over the threshold, moving into the warm sanctuary he had secretly built with his own fortune. I wasn't always the man sitting behind a mahogany desk, buying up corporate assets and liquidating estates. Julian began, his words spilling out in a quiet, reluctant confession. His deep voice trembled under the weight of a 2-decade-old secret. 20 years ago, I wasn't a billionaire. I was a bruised, terrified, and entirely mute boy wandering the freezing coastal road in the dead of winter. Your mother, Sarah, was the one who found me in the storm. I stood perfectly still. The painful memories of my childhood, at the coastal cabin, rushed forward, but the soft, soothing scent of the dried lavender in the room held me firmly in the present. I remembered the silent, dark-haired shadow of a boy who used to sit in the corner of my mother's art studio, watching the world with hollow, terrified eyes. My mother had taken him into her small coastal cabin school, giving him warm tea, a heavy blanket, and a safe corner where no one could hurt him. You were 7 years old, Julian continued, his broad shoulders dropping as he surrendered the absolute truth. You didn't stare at me like I was broken. You didn't demand that I speak. You just sat beside me on the floor with your art supplies. You drew me a picture. It was a chaotic, brilliant sketch of a massive stone house on a cliff, drawn in heavy charcoal and bright red crayon. He looked past my shoulder, his eyes finally rising to meet the framed artwork hanging above the battered, wooden desk. The flickering candlelight danced across his exhausted, rain-streaked face. You pushed it across the floorboards, he whispered gently, his voice thick with unshed tears. You told me that one day I would live in a fortress where no monsters could ever get inside. When the state finally came and took me away to the group homes, I managed to hide that drawing inside my coat. It was my only lifeline. It was the only thing that kept me breathing through the darkest, coldest years of my life. I used it as a map. I built an empire simply so I could buy this jagged cliffside overlooking the ocean. I hired the architects. I handed them a crayon sketch drawn by a little girl and told them to build it out of stone and steel. I spent years recreating the exact dimensions of this bedroom, piece by stolen piece, trying to forge a safe harbor for the woman who had been completely robbed of her own. Tears began to spill freely down my pale cheeks, warm and rapid. The sheer, terrifying scale of his devotion was almost too massive to comprehend. He had not structured our marriage of convenience to trap me in a loveless void. He had orchestrated the entire financial transaction simply to bring me home. Julian slowly reached inside his saturated wool overcoat. His trembling fingers withdrew a folded, heavy parchment document. I recognized the thick, water-stained legal paper instantly. It was our marriage contract, the cold, transactional agreement that bound me to him, to erase Arthur's massive financial debts. Julian did not look at the signatures. He did not ask for my permission or hesitate for a single second. He simply held the contract in his large hands and, with a quiet, deliberate motion, tore the heavy parchment straight down the middle. The sharp, violent sound of the tearing paper echoed in the silent room, cutting through the hum of the storm. He aligned the pieces and tore them again, rendering the rigid clauses, the endless stipulations, and the legal obligations completely illegible. He opened his hands, letting the ruined fragments of our transactional marriage fall gently to the reclaimed oak floorboards, scattering like useless snow into the shadows. You do not owe me a single thing, Clara, he whispered, his voice dropping into a hoarse, heavy ache. You never did. I bought your father's debts because I needed an excuse to step into your life and shield you from the world that was breaking you apart. I didn't want a transaction. I just wanted to keep you safe. If you built this for me, I asked, my voice trembling violently as I took a small, uncertain step toward him, the torn pieces of paper crunching softly beneath my bare feet. Why did you lock the door? Why did you let me believe you were a cold, calculated jailer? Julian closed his eyes, a deep, agonizing sorrow pulling at the corners of his mouth. Because of Arthur, he confessed quietly. At dinner, when you casually mentioned the Eastern Wing, your father panicked. He did not panic because he thought I was hiding a monster. He panicked because he finally recognized the architecture of the estate. He recognized the shape of the crescent windows and the exact angle of the stone on the cliff. Arthur knew that I had taken the phantom of his greatest, most shameful failure and resurrected it. The sudden realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The shattered crystal on the dining room floor. The absolute, paralyzing terror in my father's hollowed eyes. My mother deliberately driving a shard of glass into her own foot to protect his fragile pride. They had realized that the billionaire who had erased their debts had also built a massive, undeniable monument to the childhood they had failed to protect. He thought I brought you here to punish you both, Julian explained, his voice dropping into a hoarse, heavy whisper. He thought I built this room as an elaborate torture, a daily reminder of everything his failures had destroyed. I locked the cherrywood door because I was terrified that he was right. I was terrified that if I showed you this room, you would not see a sanctuary. You would only feel the crushing, suffocating weight of the ghosts your parents tried so desperately to outrun. He looked at me, his dark eyes shining with a rare, unspoken fear. I did not want you to live in a museum of your father's grief, Clara. I wanted you to have a choice. I wanted you to find the key, only when you were finally ready to open the door yourself. I did not wait for him to say another word. The remaining physical distance between us vanished as I closed the gap, stepping directly into his personal space. I reached out, my trembling hands coming to rest firmly against the lapels of his soaked wool overcoat. The freezing rainwater instantly seeped into the thin silk of my robe, but I did not care. Beneath the thick, damp fabric, I could feel the rapid, frantic beating of his heart. I slid my palm down his chest and found his large, trembling hand. My fingers brushed against the heavy, solid coldness of his gold wedding ring. It was not a transaction. It was a vow he had made in absolute silence, long before I ever knew his name. Julian let out a broken, breathless sound as I intertwined my fingers with his. He dropped his head, resting his cold, wet forehead gently against my shoulder. The powerful, untouchable tycoon completely surrendered his pride, allowing me to hold his immense weight. In the quiet warmth of the reconstructed bedroom, I buried my face in the damp curve of his neck, inhaling the deep, familiar scent of rich cedarwood cutting through the freezing rain. The storm raged violently against the glass outside, but inside the lavender-scented room, the world was deeply, profoundly peaceful. Write the life you want. I'll meet you there. By the time morning finally broke, the violent coastal storm had exhausted itself completely. The heavy, oppressive gray clouds fractured, revealing a pale, washed-out blue sky that bathed the Pacific Northwest coastline in brilliant, freezing sunlight. The estate's power had been restored hours ago, but neither Julian nor I made any move to turn on the harsh, sterile lights of the massive mansion. The natural sunlight was more than enough. The sharp, biting chill of the winter seemed to soften against the thick stone walls. Mrs. Thorne, moving with her usual quiet tact, had already opened the heavy velvet drapes in the lower halls, letting the morning light chase away the lingering shadows. The deep, heavy silence of Blackwood Crest had fundamentally shifted overnight. It no longer had sharp teeth. It was no longer a suffocating entity to be navigated around. It was simply a shared, comfortable peace. That afternoon, I walked down to the guest quarters in the Western Wing. I did not offer a lengthy, emotional explanation to my parents. I simply asked them to follow me. The walk up the grand marble staircase and down the crescent-windowed corridor of the third floor felt entirely different in the daylight. The shadows that had once stretched menacingly across the floorboards were gone. When we reached the end of the eastern wing, the heavy cherrywood door was already standing wide open, bathing the hallway in a warm, inviting glow. Arthur stopped completely dead in the hallway. His weathered hands began to shake uncontrollably as he looked past the threshold, his hollowed eyes sweeping over the soft yellow wallpaper, the battered wooden desk, and the thick patchwork quilt. He saw the childhood drawing framed proudly on the wall. He did not see a cruel monument to his financial ruin. He saw a perfect, undeniable shrine to his daughter's resilience and survival. My father's knees suddenly buckled. He let out a loud, ragged sob, covering his face with his trembling hands as the years of crushing guilt and shame finally poured out of his chest. Sarah caught him immediately, wrapping her arms tightly around his frail shoulders. Her own tears flowed freely as she buried her face in his neck, her quiet strength anchoring him just as it always had. They stood in the doorway of my past, mourning the years they had lost and the heavy burdens they'd carried in absolute silence. Julian was standing near the large, arching window inside the room. He did not step forward to offer empty, polite platitudes. He did not gloat over his wealth or demand their gratitude for erasing their massive debts. He simply stood there in quiet, respectful silence, offering them the absolute dignity of their own private grief. I walked over to my parents, wrapping my arms around both of them, pulling them into the warm, lavender-scented sanctuary. The generational debt that had haunted our family for a decade was finally, completely forgiven. Not with a calculated financial settlement, but with the profound understanding that we had all simply been trying to survive the storm's burden. Days turned into quiet, lingering weeks. The imposing stone fortress of Blackwood Crest slowly transformed into a living, breathing home. The sterile, unread books in the lower library were finally moved. Their cracked spines opened and left resting on the worn leather chairs. The heavy, oppressive rules of the estate vanished. The cherrywood door on the third floor was never locked again. I sat at the tiny, battered wooden desk in the corner of the room, the afternoon sunlight pouring through the large glass window. The heavy brass key that had once unlocked my hidden past was now resting peacefully on the wooden windowsill, repurposed as a simple, sturdy paperweight. A cool, gentle sea breeze drifted through the cracked window, carrying the sharp scent of the ocean over the cliffside. The wind brushed against the desk, softly rustling the thick, textured pages of a brand-new sketchpad I had placed there that morning. I picked up a piece of dark charcoal, my fingers familiarizing themselves with the raw, dusty texture of the artist's tool for the first time in years. I did not draw a towering stone fortress or a dramatic, stormy sky. I began to sketch the simple, quiet lines of a teacup resting on a silver tray. A soft floorboard creaked in the corridor. I did not need to turn around to know who was standing in the doorway. The rich, grounding scent of cedarwood drifted into the room, followed immediately by the delicate, floral aroma of hot tea. Julian walked quietly toward the desk, carrying a small porcelain cup. He set the steaming jasmine tea down, gently near the edge of my new sketchpad. He did not ask what I was drawing. He simply rested his large, warm hand lightly on my shoulder, his thumb brushing slowly against my collarbone in a silent, unwavering vow of presence. I leaned back, resting my head against his side, letting the absolute safety of his quiet devotion wash over me. I had finally learned the truth hidden beneath the cold marble and the signed contracts. True protection does not shout its presence to the world, nor does it demand a heavy price for its shelter. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If this journey brought you peace tonight, if it reminded you that the deepest wounds can be healed by the quietest acts of care, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again. Our story is just beginning, and the door is finally left open.